Welcome in, Therapy Flow community. We're excited to talk about the 10 stages of practice development. When you are trying to build a successful business, when you're trying to build your practice on a daily basis, you have your kind of head in the weeds a little bit of where you're at, where you're trying to go. Sometimes it's kind of helpful to have a benchmark of the journey and a benchmark of what stage you're in and maybe some changes you need to make if you want to get into the next stage. So that's what we're diving into. And especially when we talk about the final couple stages, stages 8, 9, and 10, where we talk about freedom and selling the practice and high levels of income generation, we'll have some great tips, tricks, and processes if you're trying to get to those stages or you're in those stages trying to figure it all out in the chaos of it all. Let's dive in.
Yeah, I think an interesting way to kind of look at this is like these are kind of your plateaus too.
Yeah.
And if you don't like find new innovative ways to punch through the next ceiling, like you will just stay kind of vaguely at the plateau that you're at. And so if you're a person who doesn't want to stay where they're at, oftentimes there's something different that you fundamentally have to do. And so I think that's part of the genius of like kind of knowing the development stages here. And you can't get started without getting started. And so the very first place that you get started is by starting your solo practice. So this is you just working all by yourself, figuring out just all kinds of stuff for the very first time. You know, the other day I was reflecting about when I started a business and I was like, I didn't know at that time that I had to do bookkeeping. And I remember like figuring out that I had to learn about what QuickBooks was like brain altering. And it took me like a week or two to like get my head around QuickBooks and bookkeeping and like what the business had to do. And so like there's so much in this stage that I think the important part about going out and branching out on your own is one, turning from the entrepreneur into the entrepreneur. So that
Yeah.
transition, the person who's just talking about doing things to the person who's actually sitting down and doing things. And then it's also the person who just has to be mega receptive to understanding that they have no clue what's going on and that they just need to learn a lot.
Think what's cool about being a solo practice is give or take, essentially all the profit is yours. When you don't have team members, you don't have a lot of overhead, you aren't spending a lot of money, right? You are your product as a solo practice. You don't have these giant inventory costs, maybe of some software or billing or via, there could be a couple things. But bottom line is like that money is yours. And it can feel really great when you go into solo practice, especially if you're coming from a high split or something else in your previous agency or something like that. But it can also be tough to reach a full caseload, sometimes even as a solo practice. We kind of talk through it through this lens of developmental stages. I've got a 4-year-old at home, and I'm watching him go through these developmental stages. And, we're playing a lot of Uno at the moment. And 3 months ago, he really struggled to just get the numbers or the colors and understand the strategy of Uno. And 3 months later, it's the easiest thing in the world for him, and he's ready to do something more and maybe not even play that game anymore. And so I think at each one of these developmental stages, it feels hard in the moment because it is, because this is where you developmentally are. And sometimes you come in with other outside resources or outside development because the last practice you were at taught you some really great best practices from a group practice lens and you applied that immediately into your solo practice, or you came in with a huge reputation or fill in the blank. Well, that's actually outside things having sped you up. Otherwise, some people do move through it slower or faster, but you kind of have to go through each development stage if you want to move in. And it often feels hard in the moment, no matter what, because that's just where the complexity level is.
Yeah. Building on that, you're also not at any of these other development stages while you're in your current stage, right?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make sense for you to operate like a 20-person practice when you're a solo, or when you haven't even got full yet, which is stage 2 here, getting
Yeah.
full for your first time. And this means that you've either cracked the code on getting attention, so you're getting more new clients in before they leave, or you're holding on to your clients for so long that it doesn't really matter how fast you acquire new clients. And
Yeah.
so, whatever angle you've taken, maybe it's a blend of the two. you've found a way to kind of fill yourself up entirely.
We're going through sort of this, zero to group practice development stage. Kind of an offshoot of that is there are some solo practices who go down the path of they get full and then they just stay there and they try and stay there consistently. Maybe they add in other income sources like consulting or courses or other pieces. And that's kind of a different journey you can go towards. But then that's stage three is you move from solo practice to group practice by hiring your first clinician or two. Congrats, you're now a group practice owner. And it's a huge step because your income is no longer 100% pegged to your work and your delivery. You are now no longer the only product set inside of your practice for these one-to-one sessions. But on the flip side, you have the cost of more EHR, maybe more office space, more admin time overhead to manage this person, more marketing costs, some of those things. And often, this struggle around earning enough and actually making it worth it really exists, not for your first or your second, but you really kind of only start to outgrow some of these operational costs, the cognitive load, all of that, once you have 3 to 4 clinicians actually working for you and starting to develop. So you're really like moving into group practice, and there's a lot of tension and chaos here when you first launch because there's so much new stuff going on.
Yeah, it reminds me how beneficial it is sometimes to just deploy ugly speed.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is oftentimes it's better to just to jump up as high as you can, grip onto the hill and just pull yourself up with all your might just to get over that first plateau. Because once you get over that first plateau, it unlocks like a new world, really. It really unlocks a new world because that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clinician, that first little subsection is so rocky, and it it can be discouraging, and it can feel draining, and it can feel like you have just so much to learn. But once you get over that hill, even if it's a little ugly doing it, once you get over that hill, you are forced to change how you think and operate.
Yeah.
And I think one of those first operational changes that you start making, maybe during this process, so maybe you did this a little bit earlier, but you essentially hire your first intake coordinator, your administrator that's helping you with some of the high volumes now of marketing that you yourself would not be able to handle.
Right.
And I usually recommend this is maybe your first non-clinical team member. This is maybe your first team member that is handling things that is specifically there to reduce how much time you are spending on maybe lower leverage activities. Don't get me wrong, intake is incredibly, it's the engine for your business, but it's not the highest leverage thing that you, the business owner, can and should be doing. And if you are doing it, it also means your attention is split among clinical work. It's split on HR at this point in time. It's probably split on bookkeeping, payroll, taxes, other financial items, other operational items, getting the toilet paper for the bathrooms. So you need to have someone that you can say definitively is handling the intake process, because
Right.
that is the nexus, the accumulation of a lot of the energy that you have to put in now as a group practice owner, because you're responsible for fulfilling your clinicians.
100%. I think as we talk about stage 4 and then into stage 5, there's a really big shift for a practice owner when more than 50% of your income is coming from your clinicians in the group practice instead of your own one-on-one therapy sessions. The reality is we talk to some practice owners, they have 20 clinicians before they've fully reduced. Some group practice owners never fully reduce their one-to-one clinical sessions. But that means you're being paid at a much higher rate, essentially, for that hourly work when you show up and you fulfill your own product, potentially. And so it's just still this weird relationship with your own group practice. So it's a pretty big turning point when you have gotten more than 50% of your take-home income coming from the unit of the practice, other people's caseloads, rather than your own performance and paying yourself just from those own clinical sessions. Because you're often get to see some like more time off, more stability, more opportunities to spend your time in other growth segments, because not all of your time's going into clinical sessions and trying to figure out the group practice on the side. But what this is an indication is that more than 50% of your time then is probably being spent on the group practice and developing it as a whole, rather than being stuck or just having your time segmented towards one-on-one therapy sessions still.
Yeah, this is the huge flip. This is the huge flip from clinician slash practice owner to like business owner. Like you now own an operating asset that creates cash that doesn't require you.
Yeah. And this is, we're kind of like halfway through the journey, maybe not in distance or in income, but in developmental stage of working on the practice instead of in the practice. We're one step closer of managing and developing this as an asset separate from you, instead of you. And that gets you into stage 6, which is just you've done a full reduction of one-to-one therapy sessions specifically for your income needs. And I segment it this way because we still know some practice owners that they're, doing 3, 4, 5 million, and they have 3 clients on the side or 7 clients a month. There's some number that they've chosen, but they aren't doing it for the purpose of any income need. They're doing it because they still love therapy. They're doing it because they want to stay grounded. They're doing it to fill in the blank, but they're not doing it from an operational perspective because their staff can't handle those clients. They aren't doing it from an income perspective because they want the money from the clinical sessions. They're doing it because they're still a therapist and they want to still do some therapy. That's okay. Like, that's totally fine. But really, you need to get to the point in your practice developmentally that you no longer need to do any therapy sessions, fulfill your own product, right? If you want a successful practice.
Yeah. It's a reduction of risk too. I think at this point
Yeah.
we're changing just fundamentally how we as a person operate. And when your time is split and when you're still doing session work and you're still doing you have other responsibilities, there's a lot of risk that can kind of compound here. And now that you have a big enough asset that's creating cash, like you don't need to take unnecessary risks.
Yeah.
And so it's about acting smarter and it's about fulfilling you maybe at a higher level. And so
Yeah.
on this path to fulfillment, the next step is hiring more team members in a way that allows you to get to more high leverage opportunities for yourself. And so sometimes this is hiring leadership team members or hiring maybe like more administrative staff members, hiring billing team members, clinical directors, clinical supervisors, all of that jazz. Okay. The
Yeah.
idea is that the outcome here is that 90, 95%, maybe even up to 100% of the day to day work for running your actual practice maybe is completely pulled out. Maybe not 100% yet, right? Strategies, a few other things, maybe that'll be the next steps. But most of the work now is completely taken off of your plate and you're really managing the macro elements.
Yeah. 100%. With those big macro developments, often this is where it's not just doers in the practice, but it's leaders, both clinical and non-clinical leaders. And this looks a little bit different. We've seen practice owners hit this development stage with 10 therapists, and then practice owners with 20 therapists not hit this developmental stage. So sometimes it's not quite like size or income segmented here, but it's just a little bit of like how you've approached your own time and enrollment in this process. It's difference between, hey, I still mow my lawn versus I've hired someone else to mow my lawn. It's not really right or wrong, but it is different because that means your time will go someplace else. So some practice owners will stay here purposely. They won't hire tons of admin or leadership. They want to stay heavily involved in the day-to-day life. But I also think, as we've talked to practice owners who have exited this stage, they typically don't regret exiting the stage, because a weird thing happens. If you figure out how to build the systems, the team, and the leadership, and you get to the other side of it, it doesn't mean you have to stop working on or for your practice or building or growing it. It just means you get to do more of the things you're great at. And it means you get to do more of the things that you want to do. And that is always a plus for the business. That's always a plus for the business. And then that kind of brings us to stage 8, where you're really fully operating as an owner, not an operator. There are so many businesses not in the therapy space, right, where someone on the side owns it and they have a board meeting, they have a quarterly meeting, maybe a monthly meeting, but they aren't really in the day to day. They might even have a CEO or COO, or they just have, systems on lockdown and they barely touch the asset in terms of some of those pieces. And so there's some rhythms of check-in, there's some rhythms of still acting as the owner, and there's certain owner rhythms that are associated with owning a business, but nothing day to day. You're right. You could disappear for a month essentially, and the business is still going to be there when you get back, for the most part. And that's a huge transition of owning a business, owning the therapy practice, and not being the distinct, ingrained operator of the practice.
Yeah, this if you guys own any stocks or shares or anything out there where you're buying like shares of Apple or shares of McDonald's or whatever it is that you guys buy, this is like the vested party, right? You maybe get some dividends paid out. You're welcome to some board meetings. You're welcome to actually make some decisions depending on how much you're vested in the company. And so the idea with this segment is you get to kind of do what you like. You get to do what you like. And depending on how you've broken it down with your ownership percentages or whatever, maybe you have a co-founder or multiple parties invested in the operation or success of the business. There's some kind of splitting there that happens with the profits or maybe responsibilities or otherwise. And
Yeah.
as you kind of end up, there's kind of two natural ends for a business. One natural end is that it fails, and the other natural end is that I guess it outlives you, right? And then the other end is maybe an artificial end, which is that you just sell it, right? You have this asset that just does its thing. Maybe it's operating. You have leadership that are responsible for certain outcomes and a few other things. Maybe one of the final steps here is that you decide that it is time to divorce yourself of the opportunity, and so you sell it. You're like, hey, I don't want it to, I can't take it with me to the grave. I can't. It's not going to die anytime soon. So we may as well cash out. Selling a practice is based really on the profits, the annual profits, and usually there's a 3-year window that most business buyers look at. So they'll look at your last 3 years of profits that you did annually. And then depending on a few other factors, they'll give you some kind of multiple on the profits there. And so for service-based businesses, usually the multiples aren't super crazy high. So if you have like ambitions of selling your practice for like 10 or 15x, that's not exactly how that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe you might find the perfect buyer that'll do it. Or maybe you're just really good at selling businesses. I don't know. But usually you'll be on maybe like the lower end, 3 to 5x. Maybe a perfect buyer would be like 7x the multiple, depending on how big and how profitable or what your track record looks like. And so kind
Yeah.
of keep that in mind. You guys can kind of cash out for a pretty penny if you grow your business pretty big. And you're like, you know what if I get tired of it one day? Well, you do have some options there.
It's worth noting that essentially the more that the practice owner is involved by necessity rather than by design, because this might be your main asset, and if you want to continue to work, it's you have to be doing something, and so you might not have exited your business, so to speak, from the standpoint of you're just fully off in the distance. It's doing its own thing. You might be involved in the day to day, but your role is very defined of like, oh, these are still the pieces that I'm working on. And these are probably mostly growth categories. You aren't a part of sort of the supply chain in your own business. Again, you're the main earner on a revenue level, or you're the main operator in terms of managing your entire team. But whatever spectrum you fall on of how involved you are by necessity versus how involved you are by design is also a little bit of the spectrum of how much someone would typically pay for it. So let's say you have a 7-figure practice, but the entire business kind of disappears operationally because everything's in your head and nothing's documented. That doesn't get purchased for the same amount or maybe at all as the same 7-figure practice. And that owner is like in the office a couple times a month. Maybe they do some networking and some team development and some growth planning stuff. Great. That's just them, operating as a nice, CEO by design or whatever that looks like. That is a much healthier asset to purchase, even if the profit margin is the same so there's different elements, different fragments for how these evaluations would happen and how healthy of an exit you could achieve.
Yeah. Yeah. I think to kind of close this out, Josh, how are you thinking about closing this out here? Stage
I
10.
think I think stage 10 is just optimizing your preferred inputs and outputs for the business. At the end of the year, we see practices that are doing $5 million a year, and the practice owner is making less money, has less freedom, and less time off than some of the practices we interact with that are at $1 million a year because they've approached the business differently. And so I think this is just where you have to know what you want to get out of your business. And that's ultimately how you win. We've talked about this before, but there's a difference between an infinite game and a finite game. If you're saying, no, I'm going to be in this practice for the next 20 years, great. You don't need to engineer this to sell. What are you engineering this for? Is this for freedom? Is this for profit? Is this for stability? Is this for impact? Is this for something else? You have to get clear on what you want and push your business and mold it around because it's possible. And again, I go back to the fact that there are business owners that have not defined what they've want and they've built a big business and they're miserable with it. And there are other practice owners, they have defined what they want and they've built a slightly smaller business or just as big of a business and they're getting exactly what they want from it. And the last piece, and I know Attilio, you can speak to this, is I think often we see practice owners selling themselves short with how many clinicians they think they want or do hire, how much income they want to generate, how much freedom or separation from their practice, because they just don't know how to get there. They just don't know how to do these developmental stages. So they say that they won't, or they can't, or they don't even want to try, or they come up with justifications for why they don't plan to get there. Because, oh, no, I'm still fine at 3 clinicians. That's the safe place for me. And it doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think everybody falls in the same pitfalls, and it's you don't think you need to be as big as you actually need to be. So you did the math wrong, which we're all, you're therapists. We don't expect you to be mathematicians. It's a common joke on all of our coaching calls. It's like, what's the math? And we always whiteboard it out, right? So you're clinicians, you're not expected to like know all the math, know how it breaks down. There's unexpected pitfalls literally everywhere in business. And so I think to kind of close it out, seek information, and not just information that reinforces what you think you know, but maybe seek information that challenges some of the beliefs that you currently have, and maybe also seek information that that helps you maybe move faster through these processes. The truth is that sometimes the best way through is actually just over all of it. And so instead of having to break through all the walls, just how fast can you just climb up these plateaus in a way that puts yourself in as little pain as possible? And then this becomes very manageable. And so,
Yeah.
how can you reduce your pain? How can you put yourself in a position so that you can just achieve the next plateau? And I think if you know the next plateau every single time, you just have to reverse engineer, well, what are the critical elements missing in order to go from my current stage to the next stage? And if you're asking that constantly, you're going to come up with probably 3 very repetitive answers because private practice isn't like extremely complex, but you're going to find 3 pretty significant answers that follow you, probably from stage like 2 all the way to stage 9. And if you keep following those paths and you keep just digging deeper, you're going to find yourself with a practice that you really actually do enjoy and you really do love. And you might even find that, if it fills all of the check boxes that you wanted, just maybe in a different way than you thought it was going to.
Yeah. At the end of the day, bigger definitely is not always better. However, the asterisk on that is as you get bigger, especially when you do it correctly, you typically have more profit available to solve more problems, and you get to choose more often which problems you personally want to be spending your time on. You have to be spending your time on some problems, but you're probably more equipped to spend that time in certain places rather than others. And at every stage, you see this from small to big, you always have some level of time and cash restriction. Maybe when you first start out as a solo practice, that looks like, oh man, do I hire someone to build my website or do I do it for me? Well, that's going to take time or that's going to take money. And that's a big problem of like, where do you want to spend your resources? But as you get bigger, suddenly like, well, anytime I want web development work or Google ads done for me, I can outsource that. That's great. However, I've got this HR problem. Do I want to hire an HR person or do I want to grow my leadership skills at this size of my business in order to handle HR problems? Oh man, do I need to figure out how to hire an operating officer or an intake coordinator? Each stage comes with choices. You're always going to have those choices. They're always going to be a part of your business owner journey. But as you grow and as you go through developmental stages, sometimes you get to be choosier with your resources and therefore benefit you more because you get to play to your strengths more often.
Best of luck, guys.
We'll catch you next time. Cheers.
We'll see you.